May 1943, over northern France. General Adolf Galland pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, tracking what should have been an easy target. An American fighter, grotesquely fat and clumsy, lumbering through the air like a pregnant cow. His pilots had been calling it the flying milk bottle, a joke, an insult to the elegant, deadly machines of the Luftwaffe. Galland lined up his shot, preparing to add another kill to his impressive tally of over 100 aerial victories. Then the impossible happened. The American fighter suddenly rolled upside down and dove, not a panicked dive, but a controlled high-speed move that took it from 25,000 feet to near ground level in seconds. Galland tried to follow, but his controls began to stiffen. His plane became sluggish at high speed. By the time he pulled out, the American was gone, simply vanished. Galland returned to base, shaken. In all his years of combat, he'd never encountered anything like this. The warning nobody wanted. That evening, Galland wrote a detailed report. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was not the joke his pilots believed. It was fast, possibly faster than the 109 at high altitude. It was heavily armed with 850 caliber machine guns that could shred a German fighter in seconds, and most disturbingly, it seemed nearly indestructible. Reports were coming in of P-47s returning to base after absorbing damage that would have destroyed any German aircraft. Galland's conclusion was clear. The P-47 represented a serious threat. Luftwaffe tactics needed to change immediately. If German pilots tried to fight the P-47 using traditional dogfighting techniques, they would die. He sent the report to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Galland expected immediate action. What he got was silence. Then, a week later, a summons to Göring's headquarters. The meeting from hell. Hermann Göring was, by 1943, a caricature of his former self. Once a decorated World War I flying ace, he had become a vain, corrupt, drug-addicted megalomaniac. But he was Hitler's oldest lieutenant, and his position was unshakable. When Galland arrived, he was kept waiting for hours. When Göring finally appeared, he was in a foul mood. German cities were being pounded night and day, and Göring, who had promised no enemy bombs would fall on German soil, was feeling the pressure. Galland began his briefing. He described his encounter with the P-47. He presented intelligence reports. He laid out the technical specs. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The P-47 was formidable, and the Luftwaffe needed to adapt immediately. Göring's face grew redder with each word. When Galland finished, there was a long, tense silence. Then Göring exploded. "This is defeatist propaganda," he screamed. "The Americans cannot build airplanes. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades, but fighters? Impossible." Galland tried to present more evidence, but Göring cut him off. The entire report was American psychological warfare, he declared. The P-47 was a crude, heavy machine built by a nation of shopkeepers. It would be swept from the sky. Galland pointed out that he himself had engaged the P-47, that he had seen its capabilities firsthand. This was a mistake. Göring's face went purple. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Galland pressed on. "Herr Reichsmarschall, I am simply reporting what I observed. The P-47 is a serious threat. If we don't adapt, we will suffer unnecessary losses." Göring waved dismissively. "The Luftwaffe is invincible. We have the best aircraft, the best pilots. These American bombers and escorts are temporary inconveniences." Dismissed. Galland left in disbelief and rage. He had presented facts, hard data from combat, and been dismissed like a hysterical child. The nightmare unfolds. In the months following that meeting, Galland watched his worst fears come true. P-47 Thunderbolts began appearing in ever-increasing numbers, and they were slaughtering Luftwaffe fighters. The tactics that had worked against RAF Spitfires were proving suicidal against the Thunderbolt. German pilots would engage P-47s at medium altitude. The Americans would refuse the fight. Instead, they'd climb to 30,000 feet, where the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine gave it overwhelming superiority. From that altitude, Thunderbolts would dive on German formations with terrifying speed. A high-speed pass, 850 caliber guns blazing, then zoom back to altitude before the Germans could react. If a German tried to follow into the dive, his controls would stiffen, his plane becoming unresponsive. By the time he pulled out, the American was back at altitude, ready for another pass. The Luftwaffe had no answer. German fighters, built for agility and turning, were being systematically destroyed by an opponent who refused to fight on German terms. Catastrophic losses. The loss rates were catastrophic. In the summer and fall of 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots and aircraft faster than it could replace them. Every week, experienced pilots were shot down. Men who had survived years of combat, who had dozens of kills, were being killed by American fighters flown by pilots with a fraction of their experience. The difference was the aircraft and tactics. A mediocre pilot in a P-47 following boom and zoom doctrine could kill an ace in a Bf-109 if the German engaged on American terms. Galland tried repeatedly to get high command to acknowledge the problem. He wrote report after report. He presented statistics. He brought frontline pilots to briefings. The response was always the same: excuses, denial, and accusations of defeatism. Goering insisted the problem wasn't the enemy aircraft, but German pilot quality. They were becoming cowards, he claimed. He questioned the courage of Luftwaffe fighter pilots, the same men dying in droves defending German cities. The breaking point. The breaking point came in late 1943. Goering launched into a tirade, accusing fighter pilots of cowardice and incompetence. He claimed they were abandoning bombers, refusing to engage. Galland finally snapped. He stood up and, in front of the entire room, called Goering a liar. He described in brutal detail the conditions pilots faced: outnumbered, outgunned, flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming enemy superiority. The pilots weren't cowards. They were heroes fighting an impossible battle while leadership buried its head in the sand. The room went silent. No one spoke to Goering like that. Officers expected Galland to be arrested, but Goering simply glared and ended the meeting. From that moment, Galland was a marked man. But he didn't care. He had seen the future written in contrails of thousands of American bombers and fighters. The Luftwaffe was doomed, not from lack of courage, but from being led by fools and fanatics. Big Week. The Apocalypse. In February 1944, Galland's worst predictions came true. The Allies launched Big Week, a massive assault on the German aircraft industry. For 6 days, waves of American bombers, escorted by swarms of P-47S, P-38S, and P-51S, pounded factories across Germany. The combat was apocalyptic. German pilots were brave, pressing attacks with suicidal determination, but they were facing an enemy they couldn't match. P-47S, diving from high cover, shredded lightly built German fighters. A single burst could tear the wing off a Bf-109. A 2-second burst could set an FW-190 ablaze. And the P-47S seemed nearly indestructible. German pilots reported pouring cannon fire into them, seeing hits register, watching in disbelief as P-47S absorbed damage and kept fighting. Galland flew multiple missions during Big Week. On the 3rd day, his wingman was shot down on the first pass. Galland narrowly avoided death when a Thunderbolt appeared from nowhere, guns tearing through his left wing. He managed to escape. That night, examining his damaged aircraft, Galland counted over 30 50 caliber bullet holes. If even one had hit his fuel tank or coolant system, he'd be dead. The realization was sobering. He was one of the best fighter pilots in the world, with 15 years of combat experience, and he'd nearly been killed by an American pilot he never saw. The numbers. By Big Week's end, the statistics were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost over 350 fighters, nearly 100 bombers, and over 250 pilots, many experienced veterans who couldn't be replaced. The German aircraft industry was crippled. The Americans lost about 250 bombers and fewer than 30 fighters. Every loss would be replaced within weeks. The production pipeline was limitless. Galland wrote another urgent report. The Luftwaffe had lost the battle for air superiority. Allied industrial advantage was so overwhelming that no tactical brilliance or pilot bravery could overcome it. The P-47, dismissed as a joke a year earlier, was now the dominant fighter over Europe. Goering's response was predictable. Accusations of defeatism. He ordered the report buried. But even Goering couldn't ignore reality. Skies over Germany darkened with Allied aircraft. Cities reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe ground down in unwinnable attrition. The death spiral. By late 1944, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. Allies invaded France. German forces are retreating on all fronts. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, was a shadow of itself. Pilot losses were so severe that new pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal training. In 1940, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot had 300 hours of training before combat. By 1944, many had fewer than 50 hours. They were thrown against experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft, as Galland said, sending lambs to the slaughter. The P-47 was everywhere, joined by the P-51 Mustang. German pilots who survived learned quickly, never try to turn with American fighters at low altitude. Never try to outclimb them. Never let them dictate engagement terms. But for inexperienced pilots, lessons came too late. Some units lost 50% of new pilots in their first week. The fighter pilots' revolt. In November 1944, Galland did something unprecedented. He organized the fighter pilots' revolt. With other senior commanders, he drafted a letter to Goering demanding changes. The letter was blunt. Current Luftwaffe leadership was incompetent. Goering's refusal to accept reality was costing German lives. Constant interference made effective operations impossible. It demanded that Goering step down or give commanders autonomy without political interference. The letter was signed by the most decorated, respected fighter pilots, men with hundreds of kills, men who'd risked their lives for Germany countless times. Goering's response was immediate and vicious. He called them traitors, threatened court-martial and execution, removed Galland from command, ending his operational career. Galland was devastated but not surprised. He'd known the risks, but they'd reached a point where silence was impossible. Too many good men are dying from incompetent leadership, too many lies about the war. Someone had to speak the truth, even if it meant career suicide. Galland was placed under house arrest, forbidden from flying. For a man who'd lived aerial combat his entire adult life, it was a kind of death. The end. In the final months, Germany collapsed. The Soviets are closing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Cities in ruins, economy shattered. The Luftwaffe flying on fumes, literally. Fuel was so scarce that training flights were suspended. New pilots sent to combat with virtually no preparation. In a desperate gamble, Galland was allowed to form the elite unit Jagdverband 44 with the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. It was fast, heavily armed and deadly, but too little, too late. Germany was out of fuel, time and pilots. The unit flew a handful of missions with some success, but meaningless. The war was over. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Galland was taken into Allied custody. During interrogation, he was brutally honest about Goering's incompetence, Hitler's interference, and systemic denial. When asked about the P-47, Galland's assessment was clear. It was one of the best fighters of the war. We underestimated it completely. Our leadership dismissed it as crude American engineering, but it was fast, tough, heavily armed, and produced in numbers we could never match. By 1944, encountering P-47 SS was a death sentence for inexperienced German pilots. Why didn't German leadership recognize the threat earlier? Galland's laugh was bitter. Because they refused to accept reality. They believed in German superiority with religious fervor. Any contradicting evidence was dismissed as propaganda or defeatism. I tried to warn them multiple times. But in the Third Reich, telling the truth was considered treason. The final numbers. The final accounting painted a total German defeat. The US produced over 15,600 P-47s. At peak, one rolled off the assembly line every hour. Germany produced about 36,000 single-engine fighters total during the entire war, constantly disrupted by bombing. Americans, safe behind oceans, produced unmolested. Kill ratios told the story. In 1943, the Germans achieved rough parity. By 1944, P-47s achieved 1 or higher. In 1944 alone, Germany lost over 13,000 aircrew, more than the entire pre-war fighter force strength. They couldn't be replaced. The P-47 systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe, not in a single decisive battle, but through relentless grinding attrition. German cities pounded by bombers escorted by Thunderbolts, fighters shot down by hundreds, then thousands, German industrial capacity dismantled. Life after war. Adolf Galland survived and lived until 1996. In later years, he befriended many former enemies, including American P-47 pilots. He attended air shows, gave lectures, and wrote about his experiences. Asked about Germany's biggest air war mistakes, his answer was always the same. Arrogance. We believed we were superior, and that belief blinded us to reality. Americans weren't supposed to build fighters like the P-47. They were shopkeepers and mechanics. But they took their industrial genius, engineering knowledge, and built an aircraft perfect for the war they needed to fight. And they built it in numbers we couldn't imagine. The lesson. Galland's story mirrors men like Admiral Canaris and Albert Speer, men who saw truth, understood Germany's strategic reality, but were trapped where truth was subordinate to ideology. The Third Reich was built on lies, racial superiority, ideological purity, and inevitable German victory. These were articles of faith. When reality contradicted beliefs, reality was dismissed, intelligence ignored, truth-tellers punished. The system reinforced Hitler's delusions as the Reich burned. Galland's tragedy was being a patriot who loved Germany, but saw clearly that leadership was driving the nation toward destruction. He was powerless to stop it. The P-47 was the physical manifestation of everything Nazi leadership couldn't accept. Built by a diverse democratic society, production employed women, African Americans, immigrants, people that Nazi ideology dismissed as inferior. Yet this mongrel society built over 15,000 fighters, built them well, built them tough, built them fast. The German response should have been an immediate adaptation. Instead, denial and accusations of cowardice. The Luftwaffe was expected to fight the American industrial juggernaut with inadequate resources and obsolete tactics, told that victory was inevitable with sufficient willpower. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster is what they got. The timeless truth. Galland tried to change the system from within, tried to inject reality into decisions. He was crushed for his efforts. His story reminds us that in authoritarian systems, telling the truth is rebellion, and rebellion, however necessary, is punished. Galland's warnings about the P-47 were vindicated by history. But by the time reality couldn't be denied, it was too late. The lesson is timeless. Ignore your enemy's capabilities at your peril. Dismiss uncomfortable truths at your own risk. Never confuse propaganda with reality. The P-47 wasn't supposed to be a great fighter. Too heavy, too crude, too American. But it helped destroy the Luftwaffe and won the air war over Europe. Because in the end, physics and mathematics don't care about ideology, and the Thunderbolt was the reality that shattered the Nazi fantasy of invincibility.